All right, so today we are taking a deep dive into a topic that's had philosophers scratching their heads for centuries, mysticism. And I know you love philosophy, so we've gone and pulled some really thought-provoking stuff from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy to really kind of dig into this. We're going to be unpacking what actually defines a mystical experience and how these experiences are categorized. And of course, we've got to wrestle with that big question, can we actually gain knowledge from these mystical experiences?
And it's really interesting for a philosopher because we're not just talking about, any religious experience. It's not just about like visions or voices or anything like that. Mysticism goes way deeper. It's aiming for a different type of knowing altogether.
Yeah, no, it's definitely a heady topic.
Yeah.
So the source that we're looking at kicks things off by defining a mystical experience as a purportedly non-sensory or non-structured sensory experience, granting acquaintance with realities or states of affairs not accessible through ordinary senses, introspection, etc. That's a mouthful. So how can we unpack that for a philosopher?
Well, right away, it's like it's challenging us, right? How we usually think about knowledge and perception. I mean, as a philosopher, you're probably familiar with Plato's theory of form.
Right, so that realm of perfect and unchanging essences.
Exactly. So some argue that mystical experiences, this could be a way to actually access this realm, like glimpsing those forms directly. It's kind of like you're bypassing the senses and tapping into a different level of reality.
Hmm, that's fascinating. But if these experiences are so different from our everyday perceptions, how do we even categorize them?
Yeah, well, the source points to a couple of key ways. First, there's this distinction between what they call extrovertive and introvertive experiences. So extrovertive, those still involve the senses, but just in a heightened way. Imagine feeling this profound sense of unity with nature.
Okay, yeah, I can see how that'd be very different from just looking at a tree.
Right. And then on the other hand, you've got introvertive experiences, and those are more inwardly focused. So think about achieving a state of pure consciousness where all thoughts and sensations just fall away. And this is where it gets really interesting for a philosopher, because how do you even talk about something that's beyond thought?
It definitely raises questions about, like, the limits of language.
Yeah.
But then there's another layer to this whole categorization, right? Something about dualism and monism.
Yeah, exactly. So the second way of categorizing gets at the relationship between the experiencer and what they're experiencing. So in a dualistic experience, there's still a sense of separation. You can think of like a theistic mystic communing with God.
So there's still a line between them, even in this deep connection.
Yeah, precisely. There's the mystic and then there's God. Two distinct entities. But then in a monistic experience, that separation completely dissolves. It's like this total merging, a sense of oneness where all duality just disappears. Whoa.
Now, that's a mind-bending concept. But, the source points out an important nuance about how mystics actually talk about these experiences, especially when they use language like union with God.
Yeah, and this is key because classical mystics, even when they're using language like union, they rarely meant a literal merging of beings.
So they weren't talking about, like, becoming God in some kind of, like, ontological sense.
Right. It's more about a profound connection, a transformation of one's being, kind of a shift in perspective, not a merging of substances.
So it's almost like they're trying to use language to point to something that's beyond words.
Exactly. And this brings us to one of the hallmarks of these mystical experiences, what they call ineffability, the idea that they're basically impossible to fully describe or express in language.
Now, that's a red flag for a philosopher. Like, if you can't articulate it, how can it be considered knowledge?
Yeah, that's the paradox, right. Mystics themselves, they often acknowledge these limitations of language. So they might resort to metaphors, poetry, even paradoxical statements to try and convey what they experienced.
So even the language they use kind of challenges our typical philosophical frameworks.
Absolutely. They're basically saying that trying to fit a mystical experience into, logic is like trying to capture the ocean in a teacup.
You're always going to lose something in the translation.
Exactly. But then the question becomes like, if it's so difficult to express, how can we even be sure that these experiences are anything more than just feelings?
Right, and that's where another hallmark of mystical experiences comes in, the noetic quality.
Okay, break that down for me. What does noetic even mean in this context?
So think of it like a deep intuitive knowing. It's not just an emotion or a feeling. These experiences, they carry with them a sense of profound insight, truth revealed, like a reality that's more real than our everyday reality.
So it's like they're not just feeling something, they're gaining knowledge from that feeling. Exactly. I mean, think about it this way. Let's say you have this deep ethical realization. Maybe a sudden understanding of how everything is interconnected. That might be sparked by an emotional experience, but the insight itself, it feels like knowledge, right?
I can see that.
Mm.
But some people would say even those profound insights could just be tricks of the mind, right?
Especially when you start talking about things like pure consciousness events, where people claim to experience a complete void, like an absence of all content.
And that's where the debate gets really, really heated. Can you truly have an experience of nothingness? Is it even possible for consciousness to exist without being conscious of something? It's a question that's like puzzled philosophers for, gosh, centuries. And there's no easy answer. Some would say that consciousness, like by its very nature, needs an object. To be conscious is to be conscious of something.
So even in these like so-called pure consciousness events, there must be some content there, even if it's just the awareness of nothingness. Right, but then you've got mystics like Paramartha and Eckhart, and they describe this like radical emptying out, this state of pure unconditioned awareness where like even the sense of self dissolves. How do you reconcile these seemingly contradictory experiences?
Yeah, it's like they're describing a state of consciousness that's completely foreign to our ordinary way of thinking.
Right.
It's no wonder this whole topic generates so much debate, and it gets even more complex when you consider like the role of culture and individual interpretation, right? I mean, doesn't that kind of cast doubt on the whole idea that there's even such a thing as a universal mystical experience?
That's a crucial point. That leads us right to the heart of the essentialism versus constructivism debate. So essentialists, they argue that despite, all the surface differences, all mystical experiences share this common core, like a fundamental state of consciousness that's the same for everyone, regardless of, their background or their beliefs.
So they're saying whether you're a Christian mystic experiencing this union with God or a Buddhist achieving nirvana, you're essentially tapping into the same underlying reality.
Precisely. It's like different cultures are just using different languages to describe the same fundamental experience. Think of it this way, like we all experience the same physical world, but, our individual perceptions and interpretations are shaped by our backgrounds and experiences.
Right, that's a good analogy.
Right.
But wouldn't a constructivist then counter that the very categories that we use to understand reality, aren't those also culturally determined? I mean, so even if there is some underlying commonality to these experiences, our interpretations, they're always going to be kind of filtered through our cultural lens.
That's the heart of the constructivist argument. There is no such thing as a pure mystical experience, untouched by culture or belief. They might even argue that the very notion of a pure consciousness event, that is a product of those specific philosophical and religious traditions.
Okay, so, I mean, if we take the constructivist view seriously, what are the implications for, how we evaluate these experiences? Does it mean they can't offer us any, like, genuine knowledge about reality?
That is the million-dollar question, and it brings us to the big one, the one that's been, haunting philosophers forever. Can we actually know anything from mystical experiences?
As a philosopher, that's what I want to get to the bottom of. I mean, if these experiences are so personal, so ineffable, so culturally bound, can they really tell us anything objective about the universe? Or are they just interesting psychological phenomena?
There are a few different approaches to this really thorny question. One is what they call the doxastic practice approach, and this was championed by William Alston. He argued that religious and mystical experiences can be part of a legitimate doxastic practice.
Yeah, I remember that term from my studies. Remind me what a doxastic practice is again.
Essentially, it's like it's a socially established way of forming and evaluating beliefs. Think about sense perception. We've got a whole set of practices for determining whether what we see and hear and touch is actually real, right? We check our perceptions against each other's. We look for consistency over time. We use instruments to confirm our observations.
Right, so it's not just about individual experience, it's about how a community kind of collectively determines what's real and what's not.
Exactly. And Alston argued that religious and mystical experiences, they can function in a similar way. So if a community has, this long-standing tradition of interpreting certain experiences as like divine revelations, and they have a system for checking those experiences against their scriptures, their doctrines, the experiences of others, then it's rational for them to believe in those revelations.
Okay, I see where he's coming from, but, as a philosopher, I'm immediately skeptical. Wouldn't a constructivist say that these, like, systems of checking, that they're just reinforcing pre-existing biases? Isn't it just circular reasoning to validate an experience based on a belief system that's already, predisposed to accept that type of experience?
That's a very valid criticism. And it highlights the challenges of trying to establish any kind of, objective criteria for evaluating these intensely personal and subjective experiences.
So where do we go from there? Is there any way to kind of escape that subjective trap?
Some philosophers, they appeal to what they call the argument from experience. They suggest that the sheer power and transformative nature of these mystical experiences, that lends them a certain, evidential weight.
It's like saying, look, I know it's hard to describe, but I felt something real, something profound. It changed me.
Exactly. And they might draw this parallel to sense perception. If I see a table in front of me and I can, touch it and interact with it, I have a good reason to believe it's real. Similarly, if someone has a mystical experience and it feels more real than anything they've ever known and it leads to, lasting positive changes in their life, isn't that at least some reason to think it reflects a genuine aspect of reality?
That's a compelling argument, but I can already hear the counter-arguments brewing in my, philosophical mind. For one thing, mystical experiences, they're notoriously hard to, describe or verify. Unlike seeing a table, which we can all agree on, mystical experiences are intensely personal and often ineffable. So how do we compare and contrast them? How do we know they're not just elaborate hallucinations or wishful thinking?
Those are crucial questions. And they lead to another major challenge for this argument from experience, which is, conflicting experiences. You've got different mystics from different traditions, and they often describe vastly different realities, even contradictory ones. So if they're all tapping into the same ultimate truth, how do we account for those discrepancies?
It's like everyone's looking through a different kaleidoscope and claiming that they're seeing the same ultimate pattern. How do we even begin to, sort through these conflicting accounts? And doesn't this problem get even more kind of amplified when we consider the impact of gender and culture? I mean, we can't just assume that everyone's having the same experience and interpreting it the same way.
Absolutely. Feminist critiques of mysticism, they've pointed out that traditional studies have often been biased towards, male experiences, and they've neglected those unique perspectives and challenges faced by women mystics throughout history.
So the whole idea of a universal mystical experience might be a lot more complicated than it first appears. We have to acknowledge that these experiences are shaped by a whole web of individual and cultural and historical factors.
Precisely. Which makes it even harder to figure out what, if anything, we can definitively know from these experiences.
So where does this leave us? I mean, are mystical experiences ultimately just these, interesting subjective phenomena? Or can they actually offer genuine insights into the nature of reality? And if they can, how do we reconcile the vast diversity of those experiences with the search for a unified truth?
Those are questions that, honestly, philosophers have grappled with for millennia. And while we might not arrive at any definitive answers today exploring these different perspectives, it helps us appreciate the complexity and the mystery of mystical experiences.
It's like we're peeling back these layers of an onion, revealing more and more nuance with every layer. But before we get totally lost to the philosophical weeds here, I'm kind of curious to bring things into the modern world. There's this growing trend of secular mysticism that I think is super relevant, for a philosopher. It seems like more and more people are looking for those benefits, of mystical practices, like mindfulness and self-awareness and that sense of interconnectedness, but they don't want, the traditional religious baggage that can sometimes come with it.
It's fascinating, right? And it really begs the question, can you have mysticism without belief in the transcendent? Can you have the experience without the metaphysics? Can you cultivate those profound states of consciousness without actually subscribing to, a particular belief system?
People are experimenting with all sorts of things now, right? Mindfulness, meditation, even psychedelics and therapy to try to achieve these altered states. But can you really get the same depth of insight, that same transformative power, without believing in, something beyond the material world?
It's a tough one. Some people say no way, right? That the mystical experience, it's inherently tied to that belief in the transcendent, that without it, you're just kind of tinkering with your brain chemistry. You're not really accessing a deeper reality.
I imagine there's some other perspectives on that, though, too.
Oh, absolutely. Others argue that the experience itself, that's what really matters, and that the interpretation can be flexible. They say even if there isn't a God in, the traditional sense, there's still something really meaningful about experiencing that sense of unity with the universe, that dissolution of the ego, that feeling of just boundless compassion. And these experiences, they can be transformative no matter what kind of metaphysical framework we put on them.
So then the question becomes, where does belief even fit into all of this? Is it a prerequisite for a mystical experience, or could it even be a consequence?
Now, that is worth pondering, isn't it? Could it be that these profound experiences, even in, a secular context, could lead people to develop their own spiritual beliefs, even if those beliefs don't fit neatly into our existing religious frameworks?
That's fascinating to think about. Maybe the mystical experience is kind of like a seed, and the belief system is like the soil where it grows. Different soils are going to produce different plants, but the seed itself, it has the potential to flourish in a lot of different environments.
I love that analogy. And as a philosopher, I'm sure you can see how this plays out in terms of, ethics and morality. If mystical experiences can kind of be separated from those traditional religious frameworks, how does that change how we approach ethics? Could secular mysticism maybe even offer like a new foundation for moral philosophy?
It's a really thought-provoking question. It seems like we're at the beginning of a whole new era of mystical exploration, one that's not limited by those old rules of traditional religion. It's exciting, but it's also a little bit intimidating, isn't it?
For sure, it's a call to be careful and thoughtful, open-minded, and really willing to challenge everything we think we know about, reality and consciousness and the human experience.
Well, that brings us to the end of our deep dive into mysticism. We've covered a lot of ground, from those deep philosophical foundations to how this is all showing up in the world today. But as always, what really matters is what you take away from all of this. We've given you the building blocks, but the questions that come out of all this, those are the really juicy parts. Does a mystical experience have to be connected to some kind of belief system to be valid? What happens to ethics in a world where more and more people are having these experiences, even if they're calling them secular? These questions, they deserve more exploration, more thought, and hey, maybe even a little mystical insight of your own. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive, and until next time, keep seeking, keep questioning, and keep diving deep.